You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. More than 3 million Ukrainians have fled the country as Russian forces destroy entire cities. In San Francisco, nonprofits are racing to get medical supplies into Ukraine and bringing refugees into the Bay Area. They're also worrying about their own family members fleeing for safety.
My relatives are in Ukraine right now, and I just tried to talk to them 5 minutes ago, and they said that they have an air raid siren, so they're going to the shelter.
Meanwhile, Ukrainians in San Francisco are trying to stop the spread of Russian disinformation, which is tearing apart families living on opposite sides of the border.
I'm angry, I'm mad, and there is no emotion. My voice is trembling. I don't know what to say. The one thing I know that Russian and Ukrainians will never be the same.
I'm Sylvie Sturm, and this is Civic.
Душу тіло ми положим за нашу свободу.
That's Ukrainian performer Anichka singing her country's national anthem titled Ukraine is Not Yet Lost. She sang for a crowd of several hundred in Golden Gate Park's music concourse in mid-March. The show, called Slava Ukraini, or Glory to Ukraine, was a fundraiser for the World Central Kitchen, which is helping to feed Ukrainian refugees.
Slava Ukraini!
Census estimates show that about 40,000 Bay Area residents were either born in Ukraine or have Ukrainian ancestry, and nearly a quarter of them live in San Francisco. For more than a month, they've been anxiously communicating with family and friends in Ukraine, desperate for any news that lets them know their loved ones are safe. I spoke with Ukrainians at the event about the heart-wrenching exchanges they're having with loved ones who are living through the horror and mayhem of Russian attacks. Kate Nils and her sister Svetlana Rosen were born in Odessa. They've been in San Francisco for over 25 years. I met up with them in Golden Gate Park as they were giving audience members sunflowers, the national flower of Ukraine. Kate said she was in shock.
I can't believe it's a reality that we live in at this point, that somebody somewhere where I grew up, my childhood, and we're being attacked by somewhere where my relatives live, and we have childhood there too. So it's really hard emotionally. It's heartbreaking for all those people who are suffering, who are innocent. I have an aunt who lives in Russia, in Moscow, who is very much in turmoil as well with everything that's been happening. I have friends who still live in Ukraine, Odessa, which is where I'm from, and talking to them and having them communicate with me through a bomb shelter is just heartbreaking to even... It's like I have no words that in modern life today, with people who fought in World War II together, are now torn apart by one maniac. It's just very, very unfortunate that people who have nothing to do with it are suffering, the children, the babies, the innocence, and the loss of innocence, because many years after it's over, unfortunately, the hatred will not stop between the two. And that's what the scary part is. Like, God willing, the war will be over.
What are you hearing from people back home? You said you spoke to somebody as they were in a bomb shelter?
Yeah, they were in a bomb shelter while they were hearing everything. They keep hiding several times a day when they are told to. He feels lonely, and he sent all his family out to a safer location, but unfortunately, he is staying behind, and he feels very lonely. He's at the age that unfortunately he has to stay behind.
She read me the text she received from him that morning.
Привет, жив. У нас авианалет уже 3 часа. Бомбят военных и по жилым попадают гады. А в остальном все хорошо. He's basically saying, hi, I'm alive. I've been in the bomb shelter for the past 3 hours. They've been bombing in the areas where people are living, and otherwise he's good. He's definitely trying to keep a brave face.
Kate's sister, Svetlana, has been in constant contact with family and friends. She said while it's painful to read their messages, it's even worse not to hear from them.
We've been chatting pretty much constantly, and they're going through a lot of different stuff depending on where they're from and where they're located, what city they're from, and some of them were able to leave, some of them are still there, some of them decided to stay and fight. It's heartbreaking. We're trying to be in touch as much as we can, but some of them reply, some of them are not replying right now, so we just have to wait and see. We're also part of a lot of different groups, and there's people searching for people now because there are a lot of missing people, and there's a lot of groups that trying to find people who are missing because people haven't heard from their parents or kids, or lots of missing people.
There were indications in the weeks leading up to the first strikes that Russia would attack, but Svetlana said it still took Ukrainians by surprise.
until the last minute. Nobody believed that it's ever going to happen. I talked to my friends a few hours before it's kind of started, and they were just, nothing's going to happen. And I had to text them, and when I heard it's happening, it's actually happening, everybody was like in complete disbelief. Nobody was preparing for it. Nobody thought they're actually going to go that far. So a lot of scrambling, and right now, and also disbelief that this is actually happening. So it's a lot of different emotions. Anger, loss of home, loss of families, loss of everything, just the desperation, I guess.
As the situation escalates, Svetlana said that getting involved is helping her cope.
The reason why this is so amazing is because I feel very hopeless because I'm here and there's not much I can do to help. Everything that we do, just a little small part, like donating, like trying to fight, trying to help people, any small things, maybe bringing refugees here, anything, small things would definitely help.
I also talked to Diana Oselenko, a student at Chabot College in Hayward. She moved to the Bay Area from Ukraine 4 years ago. She and her friend Dasha came to the park wearing traditional Ukrainian blouses, white with embroidered flowers in the Ukrainian flag's colors of blue and yellow. They also wore headdresses of blue and yellow flowers piled high on their heads.
We are friends. We are 2 Ukrainians whose hearts, are bleeding from the bottom and worry about family. So right now we are all connected, and I'm so happy that here, wherever you are in different planet, different country, cities, Ukrainians get more closer together to each other. And unfortunately, but this pain, started to make people be closer. So being together with all this power, and force, I'm sure that we win, and people will hear us. We want world and people know the truth.
Diana and Dasha held signs that read, "NATO, close the skies over Ukraine," and "I need ammunition, not a ride," signed Zelensky. NATO hasn't heeded Ukraine's call to close the skies over the country. It's feared that would ignite a war between Russia and the allied countries. Instead, the alliance has focused on delivering humanitarian and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Individual NATO countries are sending weapons and other military equipment, including cybersecurity and protection against chemical, biological, and nuclear threats. NATO leaders met in Brussels on March 24th. During the meeting, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg issued a brief statement indicating where they stand.
We condemn Russia's aggressions in the strongest possible terms and call on Russia to immediately cease its military action. We stand with the brave people of Ukraine. We fully support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, its right of self-defense, and its right to choose its own path.
During the gathering in Golden Gate Park, Diana kept looking at her phone, anxious not to miss any updates from her family.
My family in Kiev, and Putin's aim, and goal is to attack Kiev because the whole government is there. They all anxious because you never know what you can expect from Putin, because every day it's worse. And one day my mom texted me and she said, today was quiet. I heard some sirens, but it was pretty quiet. I said, okay. And she said, but it makes me feel anxious too, because Putin is not that person who's gonna stop. He makes a plan and he sees that he's losing, right? There is no hate about Russians, no. But every day we getting more mad. And when Russians ask me, why you hate us? Our people dying. My close friend, she has a family. It was a family in the car, driving in the bus, and they were killed just because the family wanted to cross the board. It's all true story.
Diana was single-mindedly focused on debunking Russian disinformation that's convinced many Russians that Ukraine is responsible for the conflict. A narrative being pushed by the Kremlin is that Kyiv was carrying out a genocide against the Russian-speaking population in Donbass.
I would like to add that on our estimates and assessment, what happens in Donbass area is a genocide.
The Kremlin has also claimed that Russia is trying to liberate Ukrainians from a Nazi regime, even though its president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is Jewish. His grandfather also fought the Nazis and lost family members in the Holocaust. Many of Diana's text exchanges with her mother also touched on how important it was to fight Russian lies.
My mom's last message, it was that please tell every Russian, tell the truth, continue keep telling the truth. But if I were in Russia, I swear, and I knew the situation and I knew Ukrainians, I would start writing messages, emails to TV studios, to NATO, to different international organizations, like, we need help. We don't want this sanction. We don't want war. But what translated on TV, Instagram, Facebook, everywhere, it just Russian says, F*** America, F*** Ukrainians, we're going to be doing fine. I think they don't understand how big sanctions right now. Maybe they don't feel it yet. But it might be late when they understand.
Diana said even her own family members living in Russia are convinced that Ukraine is to blame for its own destruction.
It hurts more. So even us, like our bodies and hands are shaking, right? But can you imagine those people who are in Ukraine currently and how many messages they get? Personally, my family, they started to block all Russians' relatives. I mean, it's our relatives. My uncle, my cousins, aunts, My family says that they just can't talk to them anymore because they blaming Ukrainians. They saying bad words, they swearing really well, saying, how dare you? When it was last Sunday, I think it was like in Ukraine, in Russia, it's Forgiveness Sunday. So my Russian relatives called my family and said, okay, why did you start this? We forgive you. So Russia forgive us. And I have a question. Russia forgives us for what?
She's also heard stories about Russian lies leading to fights on this side of the Atlantic.
My friend just told me, she's from Ukraine, she said, how is the situation in America? I said, the Russians who is in America, they're doing fine because they kind of understand the situation because they know the real news. And she said, we have a friend of family who lives in New York. So he called in the Skype and tells the story. Russian people were sitting in Ukrainian restaurant, like eating and drinking with Ukrainians, like separately, different companies. And Ukrainians started to sing the song with Ukrainian language. And Russians started to become very rude. They started to fight and screaming and saying, I wish you die, you're a fascist. Now we're gonna suffer just because of you.
Conflicts like these are also happening in San Francisco. There have been news reports about tensions between Ukrainians and Russians in San Francisco's Little Russia neighborhood. One shop owner of Russian goods said his customers have been arguing with each other. He said he'd like to fly a Ukrainian flag to show his support, but he's afraid Russian backers will break his windows. The situation is infuriating for Diana.
I'm angry, I'm mad, and there is no emotion. Like, my voice is trembling. I don't know what to say. The one thing I know that Russian and Ukrainians will never be the same, our relationship, which is sad because we thought that we are brother or sister,
That tension was also palpable during the benefit concert at Golden Gate Park. I caught up with Yevgeny Freeman just as he was leaving the park. He's a Ukrainian-American zoologist who's been in San Francisco for 28 years. His eyes blazed between a shock of white hair and white beard. He warned me that he couldn't contain his anger.
I'm extremely aggressive, extremely impolite with this problem because I spent my half a life on Ukraine. I've been on the Chernobyl station as liquidation, and I love my former country. I have tons of friends who still suffering and still living in very, very nice, beautiful city of Ukraine, Kharkiv, who is completely demolished, completely destroyed. One of the biggest scientific and educational and industrial city right now ruins, physically ruins. People living under the ground on subway, on the basement, and this is unbelievable.
Did you ever think that you'd see something like this in your life?
No way. It's very, very strange because I growing up in Ukraine, but I speak Russian. My wife, half Russian, half Ukrainian, and we have no idea what does it mean. It was different. So much number of my friends live in both sides of the border, and both of them very, very disagree with what's going on. But 70% population in Russia love his maniac because it's very easy. Hitler used similar. Russia for Russian, German for Germany. Nationalism always create maniac dictator. This is what happened right now. And I'm so sorry for normal Russian people who still try to do something, but it's physically impossible. He create evil empire with army, police, and all kind of mechanism to close mouths for everybody.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has made it illegal to report on events in Ukraine that don't correspond with Kremlin accounts. He's even made it illegal to call it a war at all. But some Russians are risking their own freedom to get the truth out to their people. One protest made headlines worldwide. The Canadian Broadcasting Company reported on it from Moscow.
This protest happened on a 9 p.m. newscast last night on Channel 1 in Russia, which is a state-run media channel. And while the anchor was reading a story about a meeting between Russia and Belarus, a TV producer who works at the station jumped behind her holding a white sign. On that sign, it read, "No war, don't believe the propaganda, they're lying to you." Now, that sign was only on camera for a few brief seconds because the TV channel cut away to another piece of video at that point. And the person holding the sign has been identified as Marina Ovsyannikova, a producer at the station. And before the incident, she had recorded a video that was published on social media. And she talked about how she was ashamed to work for a channel that was spreading propaganda. She said that her father was Ukrainian, her mother was Russian. And she talked about just the what she called the aggression and how it all should lay on the conscience of Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Yevgeny said that the border between Ukraine and Russia has now become a barricade for families who want to protect loved ones trapped in the middle of a war zone.
I knew a couple of people in Russia who want to be kind of leave this evil place, but right now physically impossible because it's a dictatorship. We have already this kind of couple times example, Germany, former Soviet Union, it's impossible. And one of the worst situation of one of my friend, he in Moscow, Russia, with his daughter and granddaughter, but his mom on Kharkiv, on Ukrainian side, 86 years old, and he can completely powerless to do nothing.
He can't reach her.
Nope. Somebody stranger help her because son cannot help.
He expressed admiration for the bravery shown by President Zelensky, and he was even able to see a glimmer of a silver lining coming out of Putin's atrocities.
I tell you, interesting, we have opposition, President Poroshenko, who is support right now Zelensky. It's one of the absolutely incredible where opposition support opposition. This is what Putin make one great thing for Ukraine. He unite Ukrainian.
But he didn't hold out much hope for his beloved home country. How do you think that this will all end?
I don't want to say because I'm so pessimistic. Small 40 million people cannot support evil country with full arm and full without anybody outside help. Because all sanction very good work until June. In June will be start feeling, but in June Ukraine will be completely destroyed.
Several people at the event said they felt the U.S. and NATO should be doing more to help. Among them was Catherine Chambray, who showed her support by waving a massive Ukrainian flag and wearing a blouse emblazoned with sunflowers. Her grandparents fled Ukraine under Soviet rule after the Second World War.
This story has been going on for centuries. I see a lot of writing saying, oh, this all started in 2014. No, this started hundreds of years ago. We're sick of this. I've been revisiting a lot of Ukrainian folk songs that I learned growing up, and I can't tell you the number of them that have talk of how we will lay down our bodies and our souls, to fight for our country against our enemy. There'll be fields of the enemy's blood. But the thing is that's important to understand is Ukraine is not an expansionist country. They just want to be left alone. And Russia is an expansionist culture, an expansionist country, and a hierarchical one. These are very different cultures, and that's something that I think frequently is misunderstood.
Catherine said she's convinced that if more isn't done, Putin won't stop at Ukraine.
I think it's great that we have put together a sanctions package that's unprecedented. That's a really good first step. I do think that Putin is going to expand beyond Ukraine, and even if he doesn't, this is a democratic country that's being aggressed by a fascist regime. So I believe that a strong and early response, including a military response, is appropriate. I know that people have a lot of fears of what that means in terms of nuclear retaliation. I would just say that if we give in to nuclear blackmail so easily, we are setting a very dangerous precedent for every other actor that has a nuclear weapon, whether that's a state or a non-state actor, which I think we need to show that we're not going to be blackmailed that way.
The Consul General of Ukraine in San Francisco, Dmytro Kushnerik, also called for more support during a rally in late February on the Embarcadero that drew hundreds of supporters.
Russia's violations and escalation is a threat to the whole Euro-Atlantic security system, the future of which is being decided now. Ukraine and international partners jointly implement 3 levels of deterrence: the diplomacy, sanctions, and military assistance to Ukraine. Today, Ukrainian government takes every possible measure to stop Russian aggression together with international partners. After all, stopping Russia's aggression is the only way to restore security in Europe and preserve the global security architecture in the world.
President Joe Biden has repeatedly said that his administration wants to help Ukraine fend off a Russian invasion while also avoiding a third world war.
We will make sure Ukraine has weapons to defend against an invading Russian force. We will send money and food and aid to save the Ukrainian people. And I will welcome Ukrainian refugees. We should welcome them here with open arms if they need access. We will not fight a war against Russia in Ukraine. Direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is World War III, something we must strive to prevent.
On March 22nd, San Francisco Supervisor Matt Haney called on the state and federal governments to do more to help refugees.
As we have done so many times in the past when people around the world have experienced human rights crises that have led to widespread displacement, San Francisco must support and welcome refugees from Ukraine into our community and urge our state and federal leaders to act immediately and with determination to rightfully bring at-risk and vulnerable Ukrainian peoples and their families to the United States. Specifically, we must encourage California to accept and house more Ukrainian refugees and support access to significant opportunities and benefits to individuals and families arriving from Ukraine. This resolution will call upon our residents, community leaders, businesses, faith-based organizations, and community-based organizations to welcome these Ukrainian families in offering benefits and services to Ukrainian refugees, including but not limited to housing, food, legal representation, and familial reunification efforts. It will also urge President Joe Biden, the federal government, to work speedily to resolve visa requirements and establish a mechanism to quickly and efficiently accept refugees from the Ukraine. There is a terrifying, horrific war happening in Ukraine, and the entire world is coming together to support the people of Ukraine and the millions of refugees that have been displaced. San Francisco, too, as we have done so many times in the past when wars, civil wars, and other humanitarian crises have struck countries around the world, must step up and do our part to support those who have been impacted.
And on March 24th, the U.S. heeded that call. President Biden announced plans for the United States to accept 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. Several San Francisco-based companies have offered to help Ukrainian refugees. Wells Fargo announced a $1 million donation towards organizations helping in Ukraine, and Levi Strauss is mobilizing employees across Europe to share their spaces with refugees through Airbnb. Airbnb has offered free temporary housing to 100,000 refugees in Europe in partnership with Palo Alto-based nonprofit Nova Ukraine. They've partnered up to use the company's software and expertise to connect refugees who need housing with people offering housing. Igor Markov is a director for Nova Ukraine, which has been sending humanitarian aid to his native country since 2013. While juggling his ever-expanding responsibilities, Markov is also trying to keep track of his own family stuck in the middle of a war zone. I first spoke with him on March 4th, minutes after he got some disturbing news.
My relatives are in Ukraine right now, and I just tried to talk to them 5 minutes ago, and they said that they have an air raid siren, so they're going to the shelter. They rented an apartment in a smaller city. They were in Kiev. They escaped. It's still possible to escape from Kiev, but it's becoming difficult. And they are going to stay in Ukraine. For some reason, they don't want to leave. One reason is leaving means separating the family, because males 18 to 60 are not allowed to leave. And so that's their decision. But we don't know what to happen. The range of outcomes is very broad. It could range from the worst, essentially.
Markov has been working day and night to coordinate efforts to get medical aid into Ukraine.
In addition to people in Ukraine, we have people in Poland, and we have volunteers that coordinate teams in Romania. So the situation in Poland is that most of the supplies into Ukraine are going through Poland, and this requires drivers. Mm-hmm. In Ukraine, males 18 to 60 cannot leave the country because of the reservist recall. And so the drivers from Ukraine are women and men over 60. There are some Polish drivers that are helping with the effort, and I know there are some Americans flying into Poland to help. One of the volunteers working with us just arrived to Poland and rented a large apartment where he will host volunteers. Of course, capacity is limited, but he's working with the Red Cross, and he's then going to Romania also to work with the Red Cross there.
How do you characterize those actions of people going into the danger zones to help? How do you characterize that?
These people are brave. Many of them have prior experience, so they know what they're doing. Of course, there are always some new people who volunteer and they learn while doing that.
Incredibly tense time. How do you think this will end?
I don't know. I still hope that there is a good outcome, but I think more likely than not, it will end very poorly for both Ukraine and Russia. Russia's economy is in the dumps right now. Many plants had to stop working because the supplies from the West are not coming. Their financial system is very constrained. They lost their currency reserves. And I think eventually there will be some negotiated outcome, but Putin is bent on applying maximum damage to Ukraine, forcing Ukraine to surrender and yield to the demands, which are nonsense. Putin wants the international community to recognize Crimea as part of Russia, and no one is going to do that.
Nova Ukraine is appealing to the government to help Ukrainians who are fleeing the violence.
So those citizens of Ukraine in the U.S. who were in the U.S. before March 1st, they have an 18 months protective stay, which is a very good development. But of course, for people who were not here at the time, it's not easy to come. We are hoping that in the U.S. there will be additional help, additional possibilities to come to the U.S. from Europe in terms of things that could be done. For example, for permanent residents in the U.S. Who are from Ukraine, it perhaps would be possible to bring relatives into the U.S. Right now, this is not allowed. Only citizens, U.S. citizens can bring relatives, and we're hoping perhaps this can be improved in the future.
When I caught up with Markov again on March 23rd, he said his family was out of immediate danger.
My family is doing reasonably well. The missile strikes around them have diminished, and there are generally fewer missile strikes in some parts of Ukraine. Apparently, Russia is running out of several types of missiles. Of course, they're still bombing many places, and those towns and cities next to the front line, they're being demolished, but at least towns and cities that are far from the front line are not as affected as they were at the beginning. And so my relatives are telling me that things are somewhat back to normal, if you can call it normal, but they have all the basic necessities. They picked the place well. They're still in the country. They're helping with cyber defense, but at least they can actually spend time doing that instead of worrying about their own safety. But this is really, a very minor issue compared to what people have to, live with in Chernihiv and Sumy, in Mariupol and Kharkiv, where the city infrastructure is completely destroyed, and there is no heat. There will be no heat, no water. Food is very hard to get. Electricity is spotty, doesn't get supplied in many places.
He also shared some terrifying news about the brave volunteers who are transporting crucial medical and humanitarian aid into the country.
One of the volunteers that we work with reported and sent pictures of a minivan that was destroyed by shelling. And fortunately, no one died, but all the food that was there was scattered on the road, and people did get wounded who were in the minivan. So we funded a replacement minivan using Nova Ukraine funds.
Seeing that picture must have made your heart stop.
Yes. We immediately, transferred the money for the replacement van, and of course we asked if any other help was needed, and we added some for gasoline and other expenses. This minivan was going to Mariupol, which saw terrible destruction and is essentially a city that is razed. It's smaller than Kharkiv. Kharkiv is still standing to a large extent, although there was a lot of destruction too, but Mariupol, there's almost nothing left there. All the industrial capacity is destroyed. It is surrounded, but some of these volunteers managed to get through, at least to suburbs. And so this minivan fortunately, this was just a one event, at least for this volunteer, so they're not stopping, they're continuing.
Markov said Nova Ukraine has been bringing refugees into the Bay Area, and some of them are showing signs of PTSD.
I know some families where parents of my friends came to the U.S. after seeing the destruction, And these people need rest. They need to recover because they are still under shock. And I've seen cases where, a fire truck would drive by and the reaction was as if this was an air raid siren. They understand, of course, that they're in the US, there's nothing happening here in terms of there's no bombing, but the reflexes, the reaction are unmistakable.
He said that the experiences of families who've made it out of Ukraine run the gamut, but what's certain is that help will be needed for a long time to come.
There are, of course, different families, there are different people with different experiences. There are a number of people who left Ukraine, but they were fortunate enough not to see the destruction, not to see terrible things that happened there. And so, of course, it's still very stressful. There are children with mothers whose dads are still in Ukraine and fighting. There are elderly people who have to relocate because it's not safe there, but they don't always get the care and the living conditions that they need at their age. Even my relatives, there's a group of 8 people there, and there are some elderly people among them. And so when we discussed what happens if fighting comes close to where they live, well, they could move, but it's not always possible even, because sometimes people feel sick and sometimes they really cannot get into a car. And so it's just heartbreaking to hear all this, and we have to deal with this. Until the war ends, this will be a problem, and when the war ends, there will be families that are broken, there will be orphans, there will be a very large number of people with disabilities, there will be people needing treatment in hospitals. So at Nova Ukraine, we are trying to, of course, address the immediate needs, such as first aid kits and blood stopping medication and tourniquets, but we are also starting to ramp up support for more conventional hospital medicine and even medical equipment for hospitals, because we're starting to see the demand.
Nova Ukraine is asking people to host families and donate money. Aside from money, Markov said it also helps to show solidarity by using hashtag #StandWithUkraine in social media feeds and by flying Ukrainian flags. He also suggested boycotting anything made in Russia. People can offer their home in the U.S. or anywhere in the world by going to airbnb.org. Nova Ukraine is also holding a joint fundraiser with UNICEF to help the children of Ukraine. Go to give.novaukraine.org/UNICEF to find out how to donate. I'm Sylvie Sturm, and you've been listening to Civic. Civic is produced by KSFP LP, a project of the San Francisco Public Press. Our team includes producer Leanna Wilcox and contributor Mel Baker, who's also program director for KSFP. Our theme music is by John Dillon. Thanks for listening.